So again, good morning and good Yontif. The greeting officially at this time of year is Gmar Chatima Tova. May the inscription and the sealing and the signature on the statement from the Book of Life, may it be a good one. May it be Tov or Tova, depending on which phrase you're using. So that's the official greeting to everybody. We'll say the bracha and for Torah study, and then David, do you have a poem or an insight, David? I didn't hear you. Yes, you have. Are you muted or microphone's off? Muted. Microphone's off, maybe.
Mike's probably off, maybe.
He's not talking.
All right. Well, while he corrects that, we'll Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kitzanu B'Mitzvotav V'Tzivanu La'asok B'Divrei Torah.
Amen.
We thank God for giving us the sacred opportunity of studying and busying ourselves with Torah. See what we can learn this month or this day. David, what you got? Nope. We don't hear you.
Can't hear you.
He's muted.
Now he's muted.
Ruth Ann, can you unmute him?
No, I can't mute. No, I can only mute, but can't unmute.
Now?
Now he's unmuted.
No, there's still no sound.
But your microphone, something's wrong with your microphone. Check your settings.
Go down to the bottom left, there's a little arrow by the microphone.
Yeah.
And check, which microphone you're using.
Nope, still no.
How about now?
This is one we haven't encountered.
Yes, we got you now, David.
Now he's muted again.
Now you muted yourself.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can. Yes, I think.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry about this.
I hear you, but you're frozen, or now the visual is choppy, but I can hear you.
Okay, well, at least if you can hear me, I will do the poem. This is from Lord Byron, and it's from Manfred, and it goes like this. When the moon is on the wave, and the glowworm in the grass, and the meteor on the grave, and the wisp on the morass, when the falling stars are shooting, and the answered hours are hooting, and the silent leaves are still in the shadow of the hill, shall my soul be upon thine with a power and with a sign. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad we got you back totally. Okay.
Thank
you. We will not completely finish the book of Deuteronomy today. There's one last parsha, which of course is read after Yom Kippur and before Simchat Torah. That's Vizot HaBracha. So that will be included actually in the next time that we meet. We'll come very close to the end because Vizot HaBracha is only one chapter long. So we're there. All right, we're at Kitei Tzei, which is Deuteronomy chapter 20. Lenny, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, this is the same parsha that I did when the men's club, the Brotherhood, led the Shabbat service. So this parsha has the most mitzvahs or commandments than any other weekly parsha. It's about 75. And the word mitzvah refers to a deed performed in order to fulfill a commandment. Some of the topics of the mitzvahs or commandments that are covered in this parsha are family values, how to fight wars, what crops to grow, what clothes to wear, how to ethically treat people, environmental issues, sustainable living and animal rights, and how to serve God. Some of these commandments you may totally agree with, others you may question, just like any other parsha, or wonder about. There are many that I do not agree with, and I'll point those out as we get to them. So it opens up with a law about a woman who was taken as a captive in war. According to the law, during wartime, a man is allowed to take a woman captive and bring her into his home. The woman is allowed 1 month to grieve for her family from which she was taken. After that month, the man can choose to either make her his wife or send her out of the house. Next, we learn that a person who was hanged as punishment for a crime should not be left to hang overnight. Instead, the body should be taken down and buried. And from here, the rabbis derive the general law that all Jews should be buried as soon as possible after they die. We're commanded to build a guardrail around your roof to protect against a fatal fall. We're commanded to build where we shall not plant a mixture of seeds together or hybrids, or to wear a mixture of wool and linen. Do not cut down fruit trees during wartime. Do not use a big ox and a small donkey to plow your fields, because a smaller one will suffer. This would be like a 250-pound man and a 125-pound man lifting a 300-pound object. The burden would fall on the 250-pound man. Moses instructed that if one found another's a lost ox, sheep, donkey, garment, or any other lost thing, then the finder could not ignore it, but was required to take it back to the owner. If the owner did not live near the finder, or the finder didn't know who the owner was, then the finder was to bring the thing home and keep it until the owner claimed it. So this is not finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Don't muzzle your ox when it's being used to harvest the wheat. Instead, let it enjoy the grain. If someone had a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them, when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death. That seems pretty radical. I'm sure many of us have had a child who has been somewhat rebellious, if not very rebellious. And that is not a solution, even though this is what it says in Deuteronomy. Do not harm the mother bird when taking her eggs. Instead, shoo the mother bird away. This mitzvah is environmentally important in that it promotes maintaining future generations. Killing the bird would prevent more eggs from being laid. It's like harvesting apples and cutting down the apple tree, or cutting trees in our forests for building materials or other uses and not replanting to replenish the wood for the future, or overfishing the rivers and seas. The commandment offered different explanation for why we should do this, and some possibilities include so that the mother bird shouldn't suffer. The greatest pain inflicted on parents is to witness the death of their child. Therefore, this parsha says that you should chase the mother bird away before taking the eggs or killing the baby birds. Moses instructed that a woman who was not to put on man's apparel, nor a man wear a woman's clothing. No cross-dressing. Moses instructed that one was to make tassels or tzitzits on the four corners of the prayer shawl. Moses exempted a newlywed man from army duty for 1 year so as to give happiness to his wife. Moses taught that if a slave sought refuge with the Israelites, the Israelites were not to turn the slave over to the slave's master, but to let the former slave live in any place the former slave might choose and not ill-treat the former slave. We could interpret this commandment to allow refugees who have been treated like slaves in another country to be allowed to emigrate to the United States. Moses forbade the Israelites to charge interest on loans to other Jews, but they could charge interest on loans to non-Jews, and non-Jews could charge interest to Jews. Moses instructed that a divorced woman who remarried and then lost her second husband to divorce or death could not remarry her first husband. If a man married a woman, lived with her, and then took an aversion to her and falsely charged her with not having been a virgin at the time of the marriage, the elders were then to have the man flogged and fine him 100 shekels to be paid to the woman's father. The woman was to remain the man's wife and was never to have the right to divorce her. Moses instructed that if the elders found that a woman had not been a virgin, then the woman was to be brought to the entrance of her father's house and stoned to death by the men of her town. Moses instructed that if a man was found lying with another man's wife, both the man and the woman with whom he lay were to die. If a man lay with a virgin who was married to a man, then the authorities were to take the two of them to the town gate and stone them to death. The girl, because she did not cry for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. And in summary, covers a lot of different areas, a lot of mitzvah and commandment. And I think that many of them I question, and even though it's written in the Bible, I would not follow those commandments that I do not feel follow my basic beliefs.
Okay, thanks, Lenny. You're right that there are more of the commandments listed in that portion than in any other, and I agree with you that there are some that are very troubling for us, and that we, in the way that we understand not only ethical behavior, but our environmental duties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that some of those we would have difficulty agreeing with. Incidentally, they do point out that with some, not all, but with some of those statements where stoning, especially stoning at the gate or stoning by, whatever, that was the punishment, at least by the time of the medieval commentators. So let's say 1300 years ago, they frequently point out, but we have no proof that this ever happened. It was a warning, as opposed to in such and such a situation that occurred between, this person and that person last week, because there are incidents in the Torah, as we've encountered them on Saturday mornings, for example, where there have been rape and there have been incest and there have been some of these kinds of things. But in Moses's recounting and in the listing, there's no indication that it happened. It's only just a warning, just to point that out.
What about, let's say, for example, a minor point there was cross-dressing?
It's hard to see what was meant necessarily by that, because soldiers wore different kinds of, uniforms and protective clothing, for example. But I think through the centuries, it hasn't been so much cross-dressing as behaving, what we would say today, transgenderally, for a man to behave as a woman, and that they were just talking about the dress as the euphemism rather than specific behavior. That's the way that I've seen it. But yeah, the traditional community has a lot of difficulty with what's going on in our society these days with that. Ricky, you wanted to join in some?
Yeah, I've got two comments. First, there was that book of a guy living a year biblically, and he sat in Central Park, and he finally found a man who admitted to adultery. So he picked up a couple of pebbles and threw the pebbles at him.
They're right. You're stoned, right?
You're stoned.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
why
Incidentally, they pick on that because sometimes it says stoned to death, and sometimes it just says stoned. Right.
Right. But the thing is, why do they always take him to the gate, the village gate?
So it's
Why
done.
not?
It's done publicly that would be like doing it in front of the courthouse.
Oh, okay.
Because by the gates is where the elders sat to administer justice.
Okay.
I have a question.
Who's it, Meridel? Sure.
Yeah. We hear about the Muslims and all the stoning of the women. This sounds like Taliban kind of thing that they still do to this day. Do they take that from the Old Testament? I don't know much about their Bible, but
No, they take it from the cultural patterns of the Middle East.
okay.
Yeah, not necessarily. The Islam doesn't have the same approach to religious law, in the sense that our tradition, and Lenny was using the word correctly, that our tradition calls it a mitzvah, to either do or don't. That every time that you make the choice to participate in or to not participate in this particular act, makes it a religious duty, either to participate or not to participate. Islam is that this is how you show, but the practice doesn't necessarily come from Allah, from God, or even from Muhammad. It can be drawn from the religious or the practice, the behavioral practice of the culture, and then it's absorbed into Sharia law, especially if there's a conflict between the religious law and the civil law. I don't know if I explained that in an absolute correct way, but the motivation for doing things or not doing things isn't necessarily because God said so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you just said something almost sounding like Sharia law and religious law were different. Did I hear that correctly?
No, I don't know. No, I meant in the same way.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. And I certainly am not a scholar on Islam by any means. Know much more about Christianity than I do about Islam. Okay, David is on deck next for Kitavo.
Kitavo. Can you hear me all right, everybody?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can, yes.
Good, okay. Okay, this is Kitavo, and is prescribing the rituals that are to accompany the presentation of the first fruits and the tithe of the sanctuary. The Israelites in Kitavo are approaching the end of their journey, and Moses is approaching the end of his life. He knows that he will not be able to go to the promised land, and so he starts to get quite intense as he emphasizes the duties of the Israelites once they, but not he, enter the promised land, which I guess is the land of Israel, although I like to think of it as being southern Arizona, which is so similar to the promised land over where Israel is. And the Israelites are going to become a nation as God promised them, his treasured people. And then the people are going to write the law on large. This is kind of interesting how they're supposed to write the Torah on large rocks, like biblical billboards, and build an altar of unhewn stones intended for offering sacrifices. And so we go on. Let's see here. We have the portion is divided into 7 readings, and these divisions, which are equivalent to paragraphs, often abbreviated with the Hebrew letter Peh. And this particular portion has several further subdivisions called a closed portion. The first open portion spans the first 3 readings. And so forth. And one of them says, a wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and he became there a nation great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians dealt ill with us and afflicted us and laid upon us hard bondage. And of course, here we're getting into what's going to happen in Exodus when the Israelites become slaves in Egypt. And that's going to be something very interesting that we're going to be covering in the year. And so Moses and the priests told all of Israel to hear. They are the people of God. They should heed God and observe God's commandments. And as we just heard from Lenny, that some of these commandments are fairly strict, and there seems to be room in the Jewish tradition for flexibility regarding some of those commandments. As the readings go on, the 5th one, for example, Moses is charging the people, and he's getting really pretty definite and strict about this. He charges the people that after they had crossed the river Jordan, the tribes of Simeon, Levi, Judah, Benjamin, and Joseph are to stand on a mountain when blessings are spoken. And the tribes of Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali are to stand on another mountain where the curses will be spoken. And then in a continuation of the reading, Moses is teaching that, on the other hand, if the Israelites are obeying God and observing faithfully all of the commandments, then God will set them high above all the nations of the earth. He will bless the issue of their wombs, the produce of their soul, and he also is going to slay all of their enemies. And that's kind of troubling to me, because the ancient Israelites seem to be relying on the Almighty to fight all their battles for them, rather than to try to seek peace. And so forth. And as we get into, we're now going to conclude, and we're going to get into the Haftorah, which is coming. I have a couple of comments that I want to make about the Haftorah here. It is the 6th one of consolation. It is from Isaiah, verse 60. It is full of images of light and hope and an end to mourning. And it is indeed consoling to the reader, who is pretty much shell-shocked after the Torah reading, which is really pretty intense. But Isaiah, now I don't know if Isaiah knew anything about the night sky, but in the poetic writing, he says that the sun shall no more thy light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto thee. And then in verse 20, the sun shall no more go down, neither shall thy moon withdraw itself. And in the previous portion, in the Haftorah for that, he says that the stars will not shine, and neither will the constellations therein. And he might be just referring to a cloudy night at this point. We've all seen that when we go outside and it's cloudy and there's no stars. But the sun shall no more thy light by day. The only way I can interpret that is that he is referring to an eclipse of the sun. And eclipses of the sun have been known since biblical times. And the moon, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto thee. The moon, when it is in total eclipse, also loses most of its light. And there's quite a bit of this in Isaiah. And I think at this point, I'm going to stop and give the session back to Rabbi Roman. Thank you.
Well, thanks especially for the reference with Isaiah and to the stars, the constellations, and the sun and the moon and the eclipse. The one thing that I would point out that people are very familiar with, and you were quoting some of it, I call. So here's the pageantry. Is Moses says when you cross over into the promised land and you have your own fields, that everyone should take their choice produce or take of their choice produce and bring it in a basket and lay it at the feet of the high priest, and then recite this formula, which I call like the Pledge of Allegiance of the Jewish people. Okay. That's my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt, and he had to sojourn there in small numbers and came. It's easier for me to do it in Hebrew than in English. And we encounter that also. Anybody remember? In addition to the Torah portion, where else do we see that same Pledge of Allegiance?
During the Seder, the Passover.
Exactly. It's the first part of the answer to the 4 questions. Okay, that when your son asks you this day, why is this? And they talk about the 4 sons or the 4 children, and then you shall say to him, and we link ourselves to Jewish history that way by reciting the same formula, even if we're not bringing a basket of produce. So I always like to point that out, because that's where that comes from. That's why. One will either you're hearing it at the Torah reading or you're hearing it at the Haggadah on Pesach, and you say, where else have I heard that? Well, now you know the context. So that's what Moses encourages the people to do, this particular ritual, once they, not immediately after crossing over the Jordan River, but once they've inhabited the land, once they've worked the land, and they can grow their own produce and bring the choicest of it back to the high priest. That was the first type of sacrifice before they were able to even build the temple. Okay, the next portion, and I'm going to do the first part this year. Usually these 2 portions are linked together. Almost more often than not, they're linked together, Nitzavim and Vayelech. It all depends, of course, on whether it's a leap year and the extra month is added and things like that. So Nitzavim now, which is Deuteronomy 29:9 through, it's only a little more than 1 chapter, to 30:20. And most of it should be familiar to you. And if it's not, I invite you to come hear the Torah read on Yom Kippur morning, because this is the Yom Kippur portion. It's so important and so powerful in its teaching that the rabbis, not all, there's a debate about it, but most Jewish communities in the 21st century, certainly I think since the 1950s, so that's the 20th and the 21st century, have chosen to include this as the Torah reading on Yom Kippur morning. And then some congregations, as we do, moves the holiness code, Leviticus 19, to Yom Kippur afternoon. And some of the congregations more traditional, of course, focus on the story of Yom Kippur and the scapegoating and the high priest entering the Holy of Holies, things like that. But Nitzavim, this particular portion, is what our community has chosen to include on Yom Kippur morning. And usually it is linked together with Vayelech, which is the next portion, and Gary's going to be talking about that. The opening statement, Atem nitzavim lifnei Adonai kulchem, you, plural, are standing here, are positioning here. It's a different verb than merely the verb to stand. It's to be positioned. It's the same word as a foundation stone, if you will. So you are standing here, you are here and participating, you are here and fundamentally involved with the Israelite nation. As you stand here, listen, Moses is saying, as you stand here listening to me, as I repeat to you the words of God. The rabbis do a lot of commentary. It'll be quite a few years before we get there with the Saturday morning Torah group, I'm sure. But the rabbis do a lot of commentary on the whatever it is. I don't know if it's an adverb or whatever of lifnei or lifneichem. That it comes from the word. Those of you who have a little bit of a Yiddish background, remember a punim, right? Punim is your face. In Hebrew, it's panim, and lifnei means in face of. It might mean be in front of. It might mean in opposition to. You're facing one another. And of course, there are all kinds of different ways of homiletically and sermonically working just with that phrase. What does it mean to be positioned or standing in front of? Are you opposing? Are you joining with? Are you facing off with? Whatever. Pardon me while I sneeze. Excuse me. And it says, Moses says, so all of you are here today, standing here, participating in this covenant, not only those of you who I can actually see, I look out over you, I can see you, but also those who are not here with us. That's his poetic reference, if you will, to the generation that was at Sinai, which has now died out over the 40 years. So he's remembering that they're still part of the covenant, but he also includes the future, the children of the future, as well as those who will, of their own free will, choose to join the Israelite community. That's how that particular phrase is involved, and it's cited frequently during conversion ceremonies, when people who choose to voluntarily join, we remind them that in Moses's mind and throughout Jewish literature, the thought was their souls, the souls of those who would be eventually joining the Jewish people, were present at this moment of affirming the covenant. They're present at Sinai, and they're present here as Moses concludes his blessing. Okay, there are three major themes that Moses uses in this part of his farewell address, which is all of Deuteronomy. Continuing on some of the mitzvot, some of the commandments and the warnings, the prohibitions, and the encouragements that Lenny was talking about earlier, and that David reinforced as well. One is that Moses warns the Israelites against idolatry and against following the practices of the local peoples and nations with whom they are going to act or react, with whom we're going to be living. However, Moses seems to acknowledge that there will be those of the people who will submit, who will fall into those idolatrous practices. And here, as opposed to the harshness of the last several chapters, I kind of picture Moses realizing, whoa, he's been talking so long, and he's getting to be really, really tough. He's losing his cool, if you will, as he continues in this oration. He needs a break, and so he takes a break because the tone in both in oratory as well as in the literary style is different as of Nitzavim than it has been in the previous portions. So Moses warns the people against idolatry, but he also recognizes that there will be those who fall into that trap and will be seduced into the idolatrous practices. And here is where, and believe it or not, this is one of the reasons why they chose to include this on Yom Kippur, is that Moses specifically talks about God desiring teshuvah, God desiring people to return, and to return even after they've been involved in these idolatrous rituals and whatever. They can return and be included back in the people. And that seems to be, that's a different approach, rather than we're going to stone them, we're going to kick them out of the excommunicate them, kick them out of the camp and whatever. The second theme is that in words again that you'll hear on Yom Kippur morning, that the mitzvah, or these mitzvah in general, generalities, that participating in the Israelite lifestyle, it says lo rechokahi, lo washamayimhi. It's not difficult, it's not far away, it's close, it's in your heart. You can do this. You have the ability to do it. You don't need someone else to be to explaining it to you. A lot of it is supposed to be common sense. It's very close to you. It's easy to understand. You can observe it, if not with your hands, you can observe it in your intention. You can observe it in your heart. You can observe it just by even what the rabbis later interpret, is just by saying amen. If you can't participate in the mitzvah, you can say amen, that you affirm the mitzvah. So that's when they said that you can, if you can't observe it with your hands, you can observe it with your mouth. That's by saying amen, or in your heart, just by having the correct kavanah and intention. Again, it seems to be that Moses has a little bit of he's a little more, I wouldn't say patient, but a little more understanding that he had gone too far in the mitzvot and in the punishments, the blessings and the curses, the good deeds and the consequences that he's been talking about. And then the third, really, which in my mind, as you will hear, is one of the real overriding themes. And I put it in the same context in whether it was last time we met or one of the Saturday morning Torah studies. I don't remember exactly, but Moses, you compare it to the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream." Moses's oratorical style, okay, is he keeps coming back to a couple phrases. One of them is Shema Yisrael, and another one is Uvacharta v'chaim, choose life. Okay, all of these choices, these decisions about the kind of life that you will live, they're all laid out for you. And as we said before, they're not far away, they're not difficult to understand, even though we don't understand why we can't mix wool and linen, we can't mix this and that, and whatever. Some of them, but technically, they're all there for us to participate in, they're all there for us to understand. And uvacharta v'chaim. God lays out before us good and evil, life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, choose the positive ones. That's what Moses is encouraging us to do. And that's the best way to love God and to observe the mitzvot, is by choosing and affirming life in whatever we do. So those are the basic themes that appear in the Nitzavim portion. And again, you'll recognize some of those phrases and some of those teachings on Thursday morning at Yom Kippur. So I will now pass on the story to Gary for Vayelech.
Or Valelech is went, and it appears that they're talking about Moses because he's getting ready to leave. And it starts out with Moses speaks to all of Israel, reminding them he's 120 years old. I guess if we were that old, we would remind everybody too. And he can no longer be active, and he's no longer going to be crossing the Jordan River with him. He reminds them that God himself will be crossing ahead of them. And it also Joshua, who is going to be the successor, will also be leading them. And this first part to me seems a lot about leadership. And he repeats the phrase several times in here about being strong and being resolute. He uses that phrase to Joshua. He uses that phrase to all the people that he's speaking to too. And not to fear or be in dread of the armies and the countries that they're going to be going to, because the Lord is not going to fail them, and he's not going to forsake them. He speaks directly to Joshua to be strong and resolute. Joshua is the leader now, and will have opportunities to lead the Israelites. He talks also to Joshua about the 7th year for the remission at the Feast of Booths, and Joshua will read and be teaching aloud in the presence of all of Israel, so that all generations shall have and learn and revere the Lord their God. The Lord says to Moses, it's now time for you to die soon, and call Joshua in, and they are to meet in the tent of meeting. And God presents himself as a cloud at the entrance to the tent. And I thought as I was going through this, that it seemed like it was his time to instruct Joshua, but it seemed to me like most of the instruction was still going to Moses and then to Joshua. I don't know. That's just the way it kind of came across to me. He forecasts again that once Moses is gone, the people will forsake him. He will get angry, and he will hide, is the term he used in there. And the people will kind of be on their own if they don't continue to follow his teachings. Joshua, or not Joshua or Moses, I think it turns out it was Moses that was to write down this poem, teaching it to the people of Israel. And that's coming up in the next chapter. And then at the same time he's finishing the Torah. There's a couple sections left, but he's also talking to the Levites that are taking care of the ark and having them prepare to put the Torah in the ark. And then the last portion, he's getting ready to read to the congregation the poem. And I'm reading in other interpretations that he's actually singing the poem. And one of the interpretations I read, it was a cantor, said he wondered how that would be, her 120-year-old man singing the poem. But he also, as a cantor, was very supportive of the strength of using song to relate poems to people. It's a very short section, and that is, to me, it was a lot about leadership. And of course, it was also about getting the instruction to the priests and the people again about how important it was for them to continue to study Torah and to follow God's teachings. And I think that's about it. Again, they use those phrases I mentioned, and don't weaken, be strong, and of good courage. There's a lot of encouragement there to, especially Joshua, that he needs to, be strong and be resolute. That this isn't going to be anything that's easy. And then finally, he's told to go up to the mountain. Again, as I read it, it was his last day. Some of the interpretations I looked at, it was his last day. I'm not sure it was all wrapped up in one day, but that he would go up to the mountain and be able to view over the Jordan where his people would be going, and then he would join his predecessors.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. You referred to the fact that Moses is told to write down this song, or Shirah is the Hebrew. Earlier on, Moses had been taught or had been told to write down the Torah, but here specifically it's write down the song or the poem. And of course, immediately, the rabbis start asking, what does it mean? Is it the same thing? Is it just the last chapter or two? What's he supposed to be writing? But it's not a main thing. It gives an opportunity for them to argue more than anything. So Ha'azinu becomes the last portion that is read before we begin Sukkot. So it's usually read right between Yom Kippur and the beginning of Sukkot. Every once in a while, that there's an anomaly in the calendar, it just basically consists of this poem and then or song, whichever word you want to use, and then a few narrative statements afterwards. Give ear to the O heavens and earth. In other words, the message that Moses has been bringing, and this is his ultimate summation and bringing the story to a climax. But he's not just speaking to the people of Israel, he's speaking to the heavens and the earth. In other words, this is an eternal message. This is not just for the moment. God is faithful. God is always true and upright. Though we may fail to heed God's word, we may fail to follow God's commandment. Ultimately, God is still the creator and the sustainer of all creation. The best way to remember all this is to again, hearkening back to the Haggadah on Pesach, is to recount the story, to remember it, both the good and the bad. It is all part of your story, as it is part of this song. And then not just to recount it, not just to remember it, but to teach it faithfully. Ki hu chayecha be'orech yamecha, because this is your life. This is the length of your days. This is the guarantee that you plural, meaning all of Israel, that you will endure once you cross over the Jordan, and once you realize what are the best ways. And I'm going to give you a little shticky thing about this. Once you cross the Jordan and inherit all of this song, this poetry, all the mitzvot, etc., and once you pay attention to the words that Gary was referring to, in Hebrew is chazak va'amatz, be strong and be resolute. And again, that opens up for the rabbis an opportunity. Well, how can you really be strong? What does that mean? Does that mean, strength, power with your hands? Does that mean the strength of your or your will, the strength of your faith? What does that mean? They ask. And so they do a play on words, which is the kind of thing that I love to look at and remember. And so chazak is strength, be strong and resolute, be strong and of good courage. And how do you have that strength? They take the Hebrew word amatz, which is power or resolution, confidence, and they take the aleph and the mem and the tzaddik for the word amatz. The aleph stands for emet, which is truth. Okay, you have the best sense of personal strength when you are true to yourself and true to your people and true to the truth, if you will. The mem stands for masora, which is tradition, and all that you have inherited and all that that has been given to you by your forefathers. And then the tzaddik stands for tzedakah, not charity, but righteousness, upright behavior. That's where you get the right kind of strength to inherit all that Moses has been talking about in God's name. And you teach that faithfully, you teach that with strength and conviction to the generations that will come. And then again, parallel to what Gary was saying for the Vayelech portion, Moses is again told that he will die on this side of the Jordan, and that he will only be privileged to see the promised land with his eyes, but not to cross over there. Okay, so that's the summary. I want to focus on a couple of little things, especially, as you know, based on what I learned and what I studied with my teacher Nechama Leibovich in Jerusalem. The Ha'azinu poem starts out Moses putting words in God's mouth, so to speak. God says, "I found Israel in the desert," and immediately they jump in. Wait a minute. We thought that God found Israel in Egypt, not in the desert. The whole song is supposed to be a history from the time of God's choosing the people Israel and leading them, and then gives a map, if you will, a direction towards the future. When Moses is speaking or putting words in God's mouth, as it were, why didn't he start with the Exodus before the wilderness? But Moses has God saying, I found Israel in the desert. Rashi changes it around and says, God says that I found them loyal, I found them worthy in the desert when they accepted the Torah. Up until now, yes, I knew who they were and I brought them out of Egypt, but their loyalty and their faithfulness hadn't been tested. It wasn't tested until Sinai, and then some of the other experiences they have in the wilderness. Some of the other rabbis said, well, God found, and it seems like there's a word missing. Instead of God found Israel in the desert, it's God found these things for Israel in the desert to demonstrate his continued goodness, that the Exodus from Egypt and the Revelation Sinai were not unique, separate, distinct occurrences, but that God's providence will continue. So God found Israel in the desert really should be understood as God found water for the Israelites. God found quail and manna for the Israelites in the wilderness, in that sense. Or God found shelter. God found water for them. God found the Sukkot for them, temporary structures for them, so that they could begin the experience and begin the journey towards establishing themselves as a civilized nation, rather than just as wanderers or even just like animals. God found for Israel, God found that they were capable of having a particular order in their life, that they could have these mitzvot, that they could have structure, they could have obligations, they could have what we would today call a government or a judicial system, that they were ready for that. God found Israel in the desert ready for or willing to accept all these things. And then God found them, is it reinterpreted as God provided for them or protected them from the desert, from the serpents, from the scorpions, from the little creepy crawly things that all of us see here in the desert as well. But ultimately the question, and Abarvanel, one of the classical commentators, is the one who ultimately keeps coming back to it. Why did not God, in Moses's retelling of the story and in the poem, why didn't he start with God choosing the Israelites out of in Egypt, rather than saying God found us or started talking to us in the desert? And Abravanel's answer is that those who were listening to him now didn't really relate to Egypt. This is a new generation. They related much more closely to the experience of the desert, of the wilderness. And so surprisingly enough, for something that's 1,200 years old is this particular commentary. But when you take a class, I don't know how many of you might have done this, but when you take a class like in oral presentations, in speech class or something, they always said try to make it as relevant and immediate to your audience as possible. Know your audience. So Moses is looking at these people and say, what are they? They didn't come through the sea. They didn't experience the plagues. They didn't come through the Reed Sea, but they did experience hunger and thirst, and all those kinds of. So let's start there. We don't have to go all the way back. We can just start at this point. That's how Abravanel particularly answers what they see to be this question of why Moses starts in the desert rather than back in Egypt. Okay. Also, then Nechama Leibovich focuses on a couple other things. Moses is given two instructions, and again, we've referred to them because Gary mentioned them both from his portion as well. Is Moses is told to write down the song, but also to teach it to the people. Now, I don't know if you know anybody who has the entire Torah memorized. There are people who do have that. I've never met anyone, but I've heard that there are people. It's much easier to say, okay, we're going to memorize the song. So Ricky doesn't have to worry if she's not at the folk music presentation where we're going to hand out song sheets, because she probably remembers a lot of from singing it so often, and because it resonated with us. They spoke to our generation, they spoke to our emotions and whatever. So the same thing. The rabbi's question was, Moses supposed to teach the song, this last poem, this summary of Jewish history, and back to what I called again before, the Pledge of Allegiance of the Jewish people. My father was a wandering Aramean. Again, most of us know some of that at least by heart, if not in exact words, then certainly in paraphrase. But some of the Rashi and most of the major commentators all say, yeah, that was Moses's point at this time in this set, is just to give them the cliff notes, right? Okay, we'll give them the little cliff notes, and if they can memorize this, they'll remember enough of the history and the perspective and the context for all the mitzvot. But some of the other commentators indeed say, no, Moses was commanded to teach the people the entire Torah by heart. Why is it referred to again as a song or as a poem? To distinguish it from the prose, from the narrative. It was easier for people to remember without having to go into all the explicit details that might be in the in the newspaper story, in the history book. So if you remember enough about what they say in Hebrew, like Bekitzur, there's the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law, and there's also a Kitzur show, the Reader's Digest condensed version, if you will. That's what Moses is trying to do. They also were aware that poetry, or musical song, if you will, literally begs for interpretation. You can't, and here I would defer to David. That a poetry, you can't just accept it for what the lines seem to be explicitly saying. There's always an implicit meaning, the hidden meaning or something, and we are encouraged to, what does this mean to you? Why do you think that the poet chose this particular phrase, this particular term, this particular meter or rhythm? It has a particular meaning, and we don't necessarily see the same thing in narration or in a history book. You don't look for hidden meanings, but we always do that in poetry or in song. And they justify the imperative of adding your own interpretation or seeking deeper meaning in its chapter 32, verses 46 and 47. The Hebrews, simu levavchem, set your heart into this. Don't just understand it and accept it with your mind, but look for it with your heart. In other words, to interpret it that way. Finally, Nechama looks for a phrase that is also in the previous portion I was talking about in Nitzavim. The Hebrew is kilo davar reikhu mikem kihu chayechem. This is not an empty this is not, the word seems to be that she's translating it as that this is not something that's for personal vanity. It's not vain for you to do this, because if you find the only meaning in the teaching is for personal vanity or for personal improvement as opposed to communal or societal improvement, then it's your fault. She breaks up the Hebrew a little bit differently. Kilo davar reikhu, v'im reikhu mikemhu. That if you see this only as something that's vain or something that's facile, that's overly simple, it's your fault. You're not really taking it to heart. You are not really taking it into yourself and making it part of what it should be, which is chayechem, which is your life. Make it your life to seek the importance and the relevance, not irrelevance, but the relevance of each particular detail in the song, in the story, in your lives. So I thought those were important teachings from Nechama about this very, very short portion. And then Zot HaBracha, which we'll address in a month when we conclude the Torah, is even shorter. What the rabbis do, I'll give you a hint now, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again in a month, is they take these last portions that we've been discussing today and they link them together and they make a nice little teaching. We started with Ki Teitzei. Lenny started with Ki Teitzei. That's when you go out. Then we had Ki Tavo, is when you come back in. Okay. Nitzavim is when you're standing up. Vayelech is when you're walking around. Ha'azinu is today's portion. Listen very carefully. V'zot habracha. and this then becomes a blessing. So they take those last several portions, they run it together into that final teaching. Sounds somewhat similar to the Via Hafta, but when you go out, when you come back in, when you're standing up, when you're walking around, take the moment to listen for Moses's word, listen for God's word, and you will find it to be a blessing. So having said that, if anyone has questions or comments, I have about 5 minutes left on my time frame. Be glad to entertain questions or comments or other interpretations that you might have found in these things. And if not, okay, great. Again, some of these words, some of these portions specifically, some of these phrases and teachings, we're going to encounter all throughout Yom Kippur. They exist, they're in the liturgy and in the Torah portions that we read. So having said that, I will wish everybody a Gemar Chatima Tova, a good sealing to the writing in the book of life. May you have an easy fast for those who do fast on Yom Kippur. And we hope to be seeing you again soon. I'm hoping, unless Ruth Ann tells us otherwise, I'm hoping that the second Monday in October, we can continue again.
No reason not to.